Breaking news from the Arsenal transfer market. Arsenal have reportedly identified Juventus superstar Kenan Yıldız as one of their major attacking targets, but there is one enormous problem. Juventus do not want to sell him. And according to the latest reports, the Italian giants have already made their position extremely clear. Kenan Yıldız is considered virtually untouchable. Arsenal have shown strong interest in the Turkish international as they continue looking for attacking quality, particularly on the left side. But this is not a normal transfer situation. This is Juventus protecting one of the most valuable young players in their entire project. And the question Arsenal fans are now asking is simple. Could Arsenal actually break Juventus's resistance with an extraordinary offer? Because reports suggest that even 100 million euros may not automatically convince Juventus to open the door. So today we are breaking down everything surrounding the Kenan Yıldız to Arsenal story. Why do Arsenal want him? Why are Juventus refusing? How much could Yıldız actually cost? Would the player want the move? And most importantly, could Arsenal really make this blockbuster transfer happen? Stay with me because this story could become one of the biggest transfer battles of the summer. And Arsenal fans, if you would pay more than 100 million euros for Kenan Yıldız, make sure you tell me in the comments. Let's start with Arsenal's side of the story. Why Kenan Yıldız? Why are the Gunners looking at a player Juventus clearly don't want to lose? The answer is his profile. Yıldız is still extremely young, but he already carries enormous expectations at Juventus. He is capable of operating from the left, playing centrally and drifting into dangerous attacking areas. That versatility is extremely valuable in modern football, and for Arsenal it could provide another dimension to their attack. The Gunners don't simply need another player who can run down the wing. They need someone capable of receiving the ball under pressure, carrying it forward, creating chances, combining with teammates, and eventually becoming a difference maker in major matches. That is where Yıldız becomes so interesting. Arsenal's interest also makes sense because they are building for sustained success. This isn't simply about signing somebody for one season. The club want elite players who can remain important for years, and Yıldız fits that long-term profile perfectly. But Arsenal are not the only club who see his potential. Real Madrid and other major European clubs have also been linked with the Turkish attacker over time. So Arsenal know that if Yıldız becomes available, competition could become enormous. And that brings us to Juventus, because Juventus have a very different idea about his future. They don't see Yıldız as a player they should cash in on. They see him as a player they should build around. Now we reach the biggest obstacle in this entire transfer story, Juventus's position. Reports from Italy have repeatedly described Yıldız as a player Juventus do not want to sell. When Arsenal made an inquiry, the response from Turin was reportedly extremely clear. Yıldız is not for sale. Not just we need a big offer, not simply come back later. The message was that Juventus want to keep their number 10, and there is a very good reason. Juventus recently demonstrated just how important Yıldız is to their future. In February 2026, the club announced that Yıldız had signed a new contract running until June 2030. That is a huge statement. Juventus are not treating him like an ordinary squad player. He is part of their long-term sporting project. He has also inherited the famous number 10 shirt, a shirt associated with some of the greatest players in Juventus history. And Juventus clearly believe he can become one of the faces of their next generation. So imagine Arsenal walking into Turin and saying, "We want your number 10, Juventus's answer, "Not for sale." That is why this transfer is so complicated. Arsenal can have the money, Arsenal can have the ambition, Arsenal can have the interest, but if Juventus don't want to negotiate, there is almost nothing Arsenal can do. Almost. Now let's talk about the number that has caught everyone's attention. 100 million euros. Some reports have suggested that any serious attempt to take Yıldız away from Juventus would require an enormous offer. potentially well above 100 million euros. But here's the important part. 100 million euros does not mean Juventus have officially placed a 100 million euro asking price on Yıldız. In fact, some reporting has suggested Juventus could reject even a 100 million euro proposal because they simply don't want to sell him. That distinction is extremely important. There is a difference between Yıldız costs 100 million euros and Juventus don't want to sell Yıldız, so Arsenal would need an extraordinary amount to even make them consider it. Those are completely different situations, and this is why Arsenal fans should be careful with headlines claiming the transfer is close. Right now there is interest, there has been contact, there has been an inquiry. But that does not mean a deal has been agreed. The financial question is therefore fascinating. Would Arsenal go beyond 100 million euros? Would they consider 110 million euros, 120 million euros, or even higher? And would Juventus finally say yes? That's where this story could become explosive. Because Arsenal have the financial power to make huge transfers, but spending more than 100 million euros on one player is a completely different conversation. And Arsenal's recruitment team will have to decide whether Yıldız is worth that kind of investment. But let's temporarily forget about the price. Let's talk about the footballer. Because if Arsenal are seriously considering an enormous transfer fee, there has to be a reason. Yıldız has developed rapidly since joining Juventus from Bayern Munich's youth system in 2022. Juventus's own records show that he progressed through their youth structure before establishing himself with the first team. The club says he has made 115 first-team appearances, scoring 25 goals and providing 19 assists across 2.5 seasons at the time of his contract renewal. And there is another detail that tells you how highly Juventus rate him. The number 10 shirt, that shirt carries enormous history at Juventus. Giving it to a young player is a major statement. Yıldız is also capable of playing multiple attacking roles. He can start wide, he can move inside, he can operate closer to the striker, he can attack defenders 1 versus 1. And he has the technical ability to operate between the lines. For Arsenal, that flexibility could be extremely useful. Imagine an Arsenal attack where the winger starts wide, receives the ball, cuts inside, and suddenly becomes another creative midfielder. That unpredictability can be devastating. And this is exactly why Juventus are so determined to keep him. They aren't protecting a player who has already reached his ceiling. They believe they are protecting a player whose best years could still be ahead of him. That potential is precisely what makes his price so difficult to predict. Now comes another massive question. What does Kenan Yıldız actually want? Because even if Arsenal eventually convince Juventus to negotiate, the player himself would still have a major decision to make. Yıldız has recently committed his future to Juventus until 2030, and reports from Italy have indicated that he is comfortable remaining in Turin. That makes Arsenal's task even harder. Usually when a player desperately wants to leave, the selling club can eventually be forced into a difficult decision. But what happens when the player is happy? What happens when the club doesn't want to sell? And what happens when the contract still has years remaining? That creates almost the perfect storm for Juventus. They have the player, they have the contract, they have the number 10, and they have a long-term plan. So Arsenal would have to sell Yıldız on something much bigger. The Premier League, the Emirates, the opportunity to compete for major trophies, the vision under Arsenal's project, and the possibility of becoming one of the most important attacking players in London. That could be Arsenal's strongest argument, because sometimes transfers aren't won by simply offering the biggest salary. They're won by convincing the player that his next chapter should be somewhere else. But right now, there is no strong indication that Yıldız is forcing his way out, and that is a major advantage for Juventus. There is another reason this story deserves attention. the transfer window is reaching its decisive stage. As the deadline gets closer, clubs become more aggressive. Targets disappear, alternatives become unavailable, and sometimes one unexpected transfer can completely change another club's strategy. If Arsenal fail to land their first choice attacking target, could Yıldız become the player they decide to go all in for? That's the scenario Juventus supporters will be watching. Because if Arsenal suddenly arrive with an enormous offer, Juventus would face a completely different situation. The club could still say no, but the pressure would increase. The question is whether Arsenal are willing to discover Juventus's number. And reports today suggest that number could be far beyond 100 million euros. That would make Yıldız one of the most expensive young attackers in European football. And Arsenal would have to be absolutely convinced, because once you spend that kind of money, expectations become enormous. Every goal is analysed. Every bad performance becomes a debate. Every injury becomes a headline. And every transfer window becomes another opportunity for people to ask, was he worth it?